Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a world without clocks, where time was measured by the rhythm of nature rather than the tick of a mechanical hand. Can you imagine? No smartphones buzzing, no ticking of a wall clock in the background. Instead, imagine the warm glow of the Egyptian sun stretching across the sky, marking the passage of time through the movement of shadows and the changing of the stars. The ancient Egyptians didn't have clocks like we do, and honestly, if you were thrown into their world, you probably wouldn't survive without a solid understanding of their rhythm. You'd be lost. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to hear from you too. Where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are? Drop your location in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Ancient Egypt, the land of monumental pyramids, mystical gods, and endless deserts, is also a land of fascinating contradictions. One of the most surprising is how the Egyptians, despite their advancements in many fields, didn't use clocks. They had no mechanical way to measure time the way we do now. No ticking seconds, no precise moments marked by a second hand. Time wasn't a strict mathematical concept for them. Instead, it flowed with the natural rhythms of the world around them. Imagine stepping into an ancient Egyptian town. The day didn't start at a precise hour, like 8 a.m. in the morning. It began with the rising sun. That's how time worked. The sun was the clock. The first light of day, known as the hour of Ra, marked the beginning of their daily cycle. It was much more organic. Hours weren't neatly defined, but were instead natural segments of the day. The bright daylight hours when work was done, and the cooler, darker hours when the gods were thought to be closest. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians ever saw time in a truly linear way, as we do now, or if they always understood it as a cyclical force, ever-changing and recurring, just like the flow of the Nile. They viewed time as part of an eternal rhythm, where events would repeat in a never-ending loop. So, while we could set a precise time for things today, the Egyptians measured time through natural phenomena like the movement of shadows, the rising and setting of the sun, and the stars overhead. As the sun began to rise each day, the Egyptians' earliest method of tracking time involved observing the shadows cast by the rising sun. This wasn't as simple as glancing at your wristwatch. No, they relied on something much more elegant: sundials. You might imagine a basic stone structure with a stick in the middle, casting shadows across the ground as the day wore on. But these sundials weren't quite like the ones we picture today. The Egyptians had their own version, a more symbolic and sacred form of timekeeping that connected their daily lives to the divine. They used sundials primarily for practical reasons, like determining when to start the workday and when to take breaks. But they also had a deeper, spiritual connection to these sundials. The shadow on a sundial didn't just tell you the hour, it also marked the passage of Ra's influence across the sky. The position of the shadow was an indication of how closely they were aligned with the gods. If you stood in the right spot at the right time, it was as if you were in sync with the divine order of the universe. Pretty wild, right? Now, you may be wondering, how did they know when the day had really started, or when it was time for dinner? Sure, the sundial worked for tracking the daylight, but the Egyptians also had another form of timekeeping: the star clock. Now, this is where things get interesting. Unlike today, where we rely on clocks to tell us when things start and end, the Egyptians relied on the sky. They didn't use stars to predict the future, though. Instead, they viewed the movement of stars as part of the eternal cycle of time. The Egyptians even used the rising and setting of specific stars to mark the time of day or night. Historians still argue whether this was a system of astronomy or just an intuitive relationship to the heavens. Either way, these star clocks played a crucial role in their daily rituals and ceremonies. They were often used to signal important events, such as the beginning of festivals or the timing of agricultural work. These methods, which seem so disconnected from our current understanding of time, were actually deeply practical for the ancient Egyptians, who didn't have the luxury of a wall clock or smartphone to tell them what time it was. Of course, they didn't just rely on the sky and the shadows. The Egyptians also had another fascinating tool: water clocks. These were a bit more advanced than your basic sundial and were used for more precise measurements. Water clocks, or clepsydra, were actually ingenious devices that used the flow of water to measure the passage of time. Think of it as the ancient Egyptian version of an hourglass, but with water instead of sand. They would fill a vessel with water, and as the water flowed out, it would indicate the passage of time. Simple, yet effective. Water clocks were essential in settings where the sundial couldn't work, like indoors or during the night when the sun wasn't visible. They were commonly used by priests and officials to schedule ceremonies and rituals that needed to be precisely timed. It's crazy to think how far they had come with such basic tools, right? We often think of ancient civilizations as not being so technically advanced, but the Egyptians had already figured out timekeeping methods that laid the groundwork for the clocks we use today. Historians still argue how accurate these water clocks were. Some suggest that they might not have been as reliable as we might hope, given the irregular flow of water in the vessels. However, these clocks marked a major milestone in the Egyptians' evolving understanding of time and their ability to track it in a way that had never been done before. From sundials to water clocks, the Egyptians were showing the world that there was more to time than just the sun rising and setting. Now, you might be thinking, sure, they used sundials and water clocks, but how did they divide time? Was it just a free-for-all? Well, not quite. The Egyptians had a much more organized and symbolic way of dividing time than we might expect. Time for them wasn't just about the hours in the day. It had layers of meaning that stretched from the sacred to the practical. They didn't just divide the day into arbitrary chunks. Each segment had a specific role, a rhythm, and a connection to the gods. For instance, the Egyptians didn't use the typical 24-hour day system that we're so familiar with. Instead, they divided their days into 12 segments of daylight and 12 segments of night. But here's where it gets a little strange. They didn't always measure these segments by the hour as we do today. Instead, these hours were based on the movement of the sun and stars. In essence, the length of an hour could vary depending on the time of year, because the daylight hours would be longer or shorter depending on the season. That's right. An hour wasn't a fixed, unchanging length. Imagine that. Time in ancient Egypt was more fluid, with daylight hours stretching in the summer and contracting in the winter. Historians still argue about how precisely these divisions worked. Some believe that the Egyptians used a system based on observation of the stars, while others think that it was based more on practical needs, like the amount of time it took for a priest to perform a certain ritual. Regardless of the exact methods, though, the idea of time being flexible and dependent on the environment was a fundamental part of Egyptian life. Time wasn't a rigid mechanical concept. It was a living, breathing thing that reflected the natural world around them. The division of time into 12 hours for both day and night was also deeply symbolic. The number 12 held significant importance in Egyptian cosmology and religion. 12 was considered a perfect, complete number, representing the 12 gods of the sun and the 12 hours of the day. It was a way of aligning human activities with the divine. Every hour of the day wasn't just a measure of time, it was a reflection of the god's presence. So, when you worked during the day or participated in rituals at night, you were essentially stepping in sync with the divine order. It's a lot deeper than just punching in at 9 a.m. The Egyptians also had a concept of half hours, which were used to measure even smaller chunks of time. Imagine using half hours instead of seconds. These divisions were mainly used for the rituals, which were integral to Egyptian society. Each step in a religious ceremony needed to be performed at exactly the right time to maintain balance and harmony with the gods. This precise timing was crucial to the success of the ceremony, and perhaps even to the prosperity of the entire kingdom. If the stars didn't align, or the priest didn't strike the right note at the right moment, there could be cosmic consequences. No pressure, right? Historians still debate how many half hours the Egyptians had in a day, and whether their measurements were consistent across the entire kingdom. It's a complicated question because ancient records are sparse, and we don't have a complete understanding of how time was measured in every region of Egypt. But what is clear is that their division of time wasn't just a reflection of the practical needs of society. It was a reflection of their worldview, one that saw time as a cosmic force with divine significance. The ancient Egyptians were, without a doubt, stargazers, but their connection to the heavens wasn't just for navigation or determining the seasons. It was integral to their perception of time. The stars weren't just distant points of light in the sky. To the Egyptians, they were part of a cosmic order, influencing not only the seasons and agricultural cycles, but the very rhythm of life itself. One of the key elements of Egyptian timekeeping was their reliance on the stars to mark time. In fact, their earliest methods of measuring time during the night involved using specific stars, which they called night watches. These stars didn't just illuminate the night. They signified specific moments during the night, marking the hours just as the sun did during the day. Imagine looking up at the night sky and seeing the stars as time markers, each one a sign that the night was progressing. Historians still argue whether these star-driven hours were based on a systematic, calculated system, or if it was more intuitive, a way for Egyptians to align themselves with the cosmos without precise instruments. Either way, they were remarkably accurate, and much like the rising and setting of the sun, the Egyptians used these stars to gauge the passage of time. Certain stars, like Sirius, were particularly important in this regard, marking significant events in the Egyptian calendar, including the flooding of the Nile, which was crucial for their agricultural cycles. But it wasn't just the practical use of the stars for timing events and rituals. The Egyptians also believed that the stars were the homes of gods. Each star and constellation had its own divine association. The most famous example is the star Sirius, associated with the goddess Isis, one of the central deities in Egyptian mythology. When Sirius appeared in the pre-dawn sky, it was a sign that the Nile would soon flood, bringing fertile soil to the land. This cosmic event marked the beginning of the agricultural year, and it was so important that it was linked directly to time. The appearance of the stars was not just an observation of the night sky, it was a celestial message, a divine order, signaling the start of something vital to Egyptian life. It's fascinating to think about how the Egyptians saw time in this cosmic way. Their clocks weren't about ticking seconds or mechanical precision. Instead, time was aligned with the heavens, with the movement of celestial bodies marking the natural flow of events. The night sky wasn't just a backdrop to their lives. It was an active, living part of their daily existence. Time, for the Egyptians, wasn't merely a measurement. It was a cosmic alignment with the stars, a divine cycle that governed their world. Historians still debate how much these star-based hours influenced Egyptian society. Some argue that they were simply a tool for priests and scribes to organize rituals and festivals, while others believe that these star-based systems of timekeeping permeated all aspects of Egyptian culture. Whatever the case may be, it's clear that the Egyptians had a much more spiritual, celestial view of time than we do today. For them, the stars were not just a way to mark the passage of hours, they were a direct link to the divine, and to ignore the stars would have been to ignore the very order of the universe. If you thought the stars were the only celestial bodies the Egyptians used for timekeeping, you might be surprised to learn that they also employed water clocks, sophisticated devices that not only measured the passage of time, but also linked the celestial rhythms with human life. These water clocks, or clepsydra, were quite an innovation for their time. Unlike the simple sundials, which could only track the day, water clocks were designed to measure time day or night, inside or out, rain or shine. A water clock worked by allowing water to flow steadily from one container into another, with the amount of water collected being used as an indicator of the passage of time. While this may sound like a rudimentary method compared to modern clocks, the Egyptians made remarkable strides in refining this technique. Water clocks were commonly used in religious and ceremonial contexts, where exact timing was crucial to maintain harmony with the divine. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of modern timers, but with much more mysticism attached. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Egyptian water clocks was their precision. The Egyptians created different sizes of these clocks to measure shorter and longer periods. Some water clocks were designed to measure a full hour, while others measured smaller intervals, such as half hours or even quarters of an hour. It's not entirely clear how accurate these clocks were, but they were used widely for ceremonial purposes, as well as to regulate activities that required a sense of structure, like the working hours of the day. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians ever managed to make water clocks as accurate as we imagine. Some believe that the irregularity of water flow, affected by temperature, the size of the container, or even the materials used, made these clocks far from perfect. But even with potential flaws, the Egyptians used them as valuable tools in their daily lives, and their connection to the divine order was ever present. Priests, for instance, might use water clocks during their rituals to make sure they completed certain steps at the right time, aligning their actions with the gods. It's also interesting to note that water clocks were used by the ancient Egyptians not just for their religious duties, but also in legal and political affairs. The ability to keep track of time in a ritualistic context wasn't limited to just the sacred. It bled into the administration of daily life. Water clocks were used to record the passage of time in contracts, trade agreements, and legal proceedings. These clocks became essential tools for organizing society in ways that we, today, take for granted. In a world without digital devices or even paper, precise timekeeping was necessary for everything from religious rites to daily business transactions. Historians still debate the overall significance of water clocks in Egyptian society. Some claim that their use was confined to elite circles, mainly religious leaders and officials, while others argue that their influence reached much farther. Regardless of their exact role, water clocks were an important leap in the Egyptians' development of timekeeping. The symbolism of water flowing from one vessel to another mirrored the flow of time itself, constant, unstoppable, and eternally connected to the forces of nature and the divine. It's mind-blowing to think how the ancient Egyptians could create such sophisticated tools with the resources they had available. Water clocks may not have been as accurate as today's digital timers, but they were far more than just practical devices. They were vessels of time that allowed the Egyptians to sync their lives with the natural world, the stars, and the gods. As we explore the mechanics of time in ancient Egypt, it's essential to recognize one group of people who played a crucial role in keeping time and maintaining order: the priests. They were not just spiritual leaders, but also the official timekeepers, using their knowledge of the heavens and the natural world to track time for the whole society. While the common people were probably more focused on the cycles of nature, sunrise, sunset, the moon's phases, the priests held the keys to understanding the deeper, spiritual dimensions of time. Priests were the experts in reading the stars, interpreting the movements of celestial bodies, and calculating the appropriate times for religious rituals. They had access to tools like water clocks and sundials, but their real expertise lay in the alignment of these timekeeping methods with the divine order. You might imagine them in the cool, dimly lit chambers of temples, consulting the movements of the stars, preparing for ceremonies, and ensuring that every step was performed at the exact right moment to please the gods. It's fascinating to think that timekeeping wasn't just about convenience or organization for the Egyptians. It was about spiritual harmony. Every hour, every ritual, every act of daily life was intertwined with their understanding of the cosmos. The priests, as the bearers of this sacred knowledge, were entrusted with the most important duties of the kingdom, not just governing the people's spiritual lives, but also ensuring that the rhythm of daily life was in sync with the divine. Historians still argue whether the priests were the sole keepers of time or whether there were other segments of society who had access to similar knowledge. While priests likely had the most formal training in astronomy and timekeeping, it's possible that scribes, government officials, and even the pharaoh himself also had a hand in organizing time for the public. However, the priests' roles were certainly the most prominent, as they acted as mediators between the divine and the mortal realms. Priests used a variety of tools, not only water clocks and sundials, but also their own system of celestial timekeeping. They believed that the gods were present in everything, even in the passing moments of time. The hours of the day weren't just divisions of light and dark, they were a reflection of the gods' journey through the sky. The movement of the sun across the heavens was seen as the journey of Ra, the sun god, while the phases of the moon were connected to other deities like Thoth, the god of wisdom, and Khonsu, the god of the moon. The priest's role was not only to track time, but also to align human life with this divine order, ensuring that all rituals were performed at the exact right moment. And it wasn't just the passage of time that was sacred. The priests also maintained the rhythm of daily life. The Egyptians' timekeeping was often about ritual timing. Imagine the exact moment that incense was burned in a temple, or the precise time a priest began chanting an incantation. These weren't just arbitrary acts. Every movement, every word, every gesture was meant to align with the divine forces of the universe. In this sense, time wasn't just an abstract concept. It was a tool for connecting with the gods. Historians still debate whether the priests' methods of timekeeping were purely spiritual or whether they had more practical implications for Egyptian society. Some argue that the priest's role in timekeeping was an essential function of governance and administration, helping to organize everything from agricultural cycles to the construction of the pyramids. Others believe that the priests were solely concerned with maintaining divine order through their rituals and ceremonies. Either way, it's clear that time was not just a way of measuring hours or minutes. It was a divine gift, and the priests were the sacred custodians of that gift. When we think of calendars, we often imagine a neat grid filled with days, weeks, and months. But in ancient Egypt, the concept of a calendar was deeply intertwined with their spiritual beliefs and their relationship with the cosmos. Unlike the rigid solar-based calendars we use today, the Egyptians had a much more fluid and, at times, mysterious approach to time. One of the most significant factors in their understanding of time was the lunar calendar. The Egyptians' lunar calendar was based on the moon's phases, not the movement of the sun. A single lunar cycle, from one new moon to the next, was roughly 29.5 days long. This was much shorter than the solar year, which meant that the Egyptians needed to account for this discrepancy when planning their agricultural activities and festivals. But the lunar calendar wasn't just a tool for measuring time. It was a reflection of their connection to the cosmos, especially the divine forces that control both the stars and the moon. Now, you might be wondering, why use a lunar calendar? After all, it's not as straightforward as a solar year. Well, the answer lies in the Egyptians' deep spiritual connection to the moon. The moon was seen as the realm of the god Thoth, the deity associated with wisdom, writing, and time. Thoth was believed to be the divine scribe who recorded everything, including the passage of time. The moon, in this sense, was not just a celestial body. It was the embodiment of Thoth's wisdom, marking the flow of time on Earth. Historians still argue about how exactly the lunar calendar was used, especially given that the Egyptians also observed solar events. Some scholars believe that the lunar calendar was primarily used for religious and ceremonial purposes, while others argue that it was used for practical purposes like agriculture. After all, the flooding of the Nile, which was central to Egyptian agriculture, didn't follow a fixed solar schedule. Instead, it was closely tied to the appearance of the star Sirius, which marked the beginning of the flooding season. The lunar calendar helped to predict the time when Sirius would rise, allowing the Egyptians to prepare for the annual flooding. But there was a catch. The lunar calendar didn't quite match up with the solar year. This led to some interesting adjustments. To keep things in balance, the Egyptians occasionally inserted extra months into their calendar to make up for the discrepancy. This practice of intercalation ensured that their calendar stayed in sync with the agricultural and religious cycles that were so important to their way of life. It also ensured that the gods, whose movements were reflected in the heavens, were always honored at the right time. Historians still debate the extent to which the lunar calendar influenced the Egyptians' agricultural and religious practices. Some argue that the calendar was more symbolic than practical, a way to keep time in line with the divine rather than the needs of everyday life. Others suggest that the calendar played a crucial role in helping the Egyptians coordinate the complex ceremonies and rituals that defined their culture. But one thing is certain. The lunar calendar was much more than just a tool for marking the days. It was a spiritual guide, pointing the way toward the divine order that governed the universe. The passing of time in ancient Egypt wasn't just about tracking the days, but also about understanding the seasons. The Egyptians had a unique and intimate relationship with the changes in nature. Seasonal transitions were as important to them as the celestial movements they observed in the night sky. The change in seasons shaped everything from their agricultural practices to their festivals and religious rituals. It was the way they connected with the cycles of life, growth, and death, an eternal dance between the gods and the earth. The Egyptians divided their year into three main seasons: Akhet, the inundation; Pere, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest season. Each season was linked to the annual flooding of the Nile, which was central to Egyptian agriculture. Akhet was the season of flooding, when the Nile overflowed its banks and deposited rich silt on the land. This was the time when the Egyptians would prepare for the planting season, marking the beginning of the agricultural year. It was a time of renewal, of the land being reborn, just as the gods were reborn each year. Pere followed Akhet, and it was the time of planting and growth. It was a season of action, where the Egyptians would cultivate the land, sow their seeds, and prepare for the eventual harvest. The gods, too, were said to be active during this time, growing and nurturing the earth. The movement of the sun was vital during this period, as it dictated how crops would grow. The Egyptians' careful attention to the sun's movement across the sky was a constant reminder that they were working in harmony with the divine order. Finally, there was Shemu, the harvest season. This was the culmination of the year's hard work. It was a time of celebration as the fruits of their labor were gathered and the Egyptian people prepared for the coming year. Shemu was also a time of reflection, as it marked the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. For the Egyptians, the harvest wasn't just about gathering food. It was about acknowledging the divine blessings that made it possible. The gods, particularly Osiris, were honored during this time, as they were believed to be responsible for the fertility of the land. Historians still debate the precise way the Egyptians viewed these seasonal divisions. Some scholars argue that the seasons were strictly tied to the agricultural cycle, while others suggest that the seasons had deeper religious meanings. The fact that the Egyptians observed these seasons so closely, aligning them with their festivals and rituals, suggests that they saw time as something cyclical, a never-ending repetition of birth, death, and rebirth. This cyclical view of time was central to Egyptian thought and is reflected in their art, literature, and, of course, their timekeeping methods. For the Egyptians, the seasons weren't just markers of time. They were sacred moments, deeply connected to the gods and the cosmic balance of the universe. The passage of time wasn't something to be measured mechanically, but something to be experienced in harmony with nature. The rhythms of the earth, the movement of the stars, and the actions of the gods were all part of the same divine order, a cycle that repeated itself endlessly, yet each time with its own unique significance. Historians still argue about how much the changing seasons influenced Egyptian culture as a whole. Were the festivals and religious ceremonies truly a reflection of their understanding of the seasons, or were they more about reinforcing the political and social order? Either way, one thing is clear. The Egyptians had a profound respect for the cycles of nature, and their timekeeping reflected that deep connection. As we continue exploring time in ancient Egypt, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The way they understood time was vastly different from how we see it today. The Egyptians didn't view time as something rigid and linear. Instead, they saw it as a series of fluid cycles, intertwining the heavens, the earth, and the gods. This view of time, so unlike our own, shaped every aspect of their society, from daily activities to monumental rituals, and defined their entire worldview. Modern societies, including ours, have become obsessed with precision. The concept of time, as we know it, is now divided into fixed hours, minutes, and seconds. We've become so accustomed to this system that we often forget how deeply it impacts our daily lives. We schedule everything from meetings to meals with clockwork precision. However, for the ancient Egyptians, time was not something to be conquered and measured with such exactness. It was something to be experienced and aligned with the divine order. One striking contrast between the Egyptians' view of time and our modern understanding is how they define the day. While we typically break the day into 24 rigid hours, the Egyptians used a system that divided the day into two parts: the daytime hours, 12 hours of daylight, and the nighttime hours, 12 hours of darkness. But these hours were not fixed in length like our modern ones. The length of an hour would vary depending on the time of year. During the summer, daylight hours were longer, and the hours of the night were shorter. During the winter, the opposite was true. This seasonal fluctuation in the length of hours speaks to a broader understanding of time that was in harmony with nature. Time wasn't something static. It was a living, breathing entity that ebbed and flowed with the seasons and celestial movements. Historians still debate whether the Egyptians' concept of time was truly circular or just a more flexible, adaptive way of living. Some believe that their system reflected an understanding of time as cyclical, ever-repeating, like the annual flooding of the Nile or the daily journey of the sun. Others argue that it was more of a practical approach to organizing a society based on agriculture and seasonal changes. But regardless of which theory holds more weight, one thing is clear. Time for the ancient Egyptians was much more connected to the natural world than it is for us today. They didn't need to break time down into neat, fixed increments. Instead, they adapted to the natural rhythms of the world around them. The gods, the stars, and the sun all had a role to play in guiding their actions, as if time itself was a divine force they needed to live in harmony with. For example, in their daily lives, the Egyptians didn't have clocks to tell them exactly when it was noon or midnight. Instead, they followed the patterns of the sun and stars. The priests, who were the official timekeepers, were tasked with knowing the times for ceremonies, agricultural practices, and even personal events. They used their knowledge of celestial movements and the changing seasons to align everything with divine will. Imagine being one of those priests, watching the stars and calculating the moment when the temple doors could open, or when the harvest should begin. It wasn't just about practicality. It was about fulfilling a divine purpose, keeping the cosmic order intact. Historians still debate the degree to which the priests were involved in managing the daily lives of ordinary Egyptians. Some argue that the timekeeping practices were exclusive to religious and royal circles, while others suggest that they permeated all levels of society. Regardless, what's clear is that time wasn't merely a tool for daily convenience in ancient Egypt. It was a means of ensuring that life, as a whole, was aligned with cosmic rhythms. As we draw closer to the end of our journey through the timekeeping practices of ancient Egypt, we begin to see just how integral the passage of time was to their entire worldview. Time wasn't something that was simply measured and tracked. It was something that shaped their culture, religion, and even their ideas about death and the afterlife. Yet, there are still significant gaps in our understanding of how the Egyptians managed their timekeeping methods, especially when it comes to their accuracy. One of the greatest mysteries is how accurately the Egyptians were able to measure time. While we know that they had impressive tools like sundials, water clocks, and lunar calendars, it's unclear just how precise these systems were. The Egyptians didn't have the technology we take for granted today. No atomic clocks or sophisticated machines to measure time down to the millisecond. Instead, they relied on more organic, celestial-based methods. Yet, despite the lack of mechanical precision, the Egyptians were able to create a timekeeping system that aligned closely with their understanding of the cosmos and the divine. Historians still argue over how accurate the Egyptian timekeeping system was. Some suggest that the sundials, which tracked the movement of the sun, could have been fairly accurate, but they only worked during the day when the sun was visible. Water clocks, on the other hand, could have been more accurate, but their effectiveness was hindered by factors like temperature and the flow rate of the water. Even though these clocks were important for ceremonial and religious purposes, there were challenges that made them less reliable than modern timekeeping tools. And what about the lunar calendar? The Egyptians used the moon's phases to mark time, but they also had to account for the fact that a lunar cycle doesn't exactly match a solar year. This discrepancy led to the practice of adding extra months, or intercalating, to keep the calendar aligned with the seasons. While this system worked fairly well, there were times when the calendar drifted, and the seasonal events tied to the calendar, such as the flooding of the Nile, didn't occur on the same dates every year. This fluctuation has left historians with more questions than answers about how truly accurate the Egyptian timekeeping system was. There is also the question of how widely these timekeeping methods were used across Egypt. Were they limited to the priests and elites, or did ordinary Egyptians rely on the same systems? Some scholars argue that timekeeping practices were confined to the upper echelons of society, where the knowledge of celestial movements and the divine order was most highly regarded. Others believe that the knowledge of time was more widely shared, especially as the Egyptians began building larger, more complex societies and required a way to manage agricultural and religious schedules. What we do know is that despite the challenges, the Egyptians were pioneers in their understanding of time. They didn't just observe time in the abstract. They connected it to their religious beliefs, their agricultural practices, and their ideas about the gods and the afterlife. Their timekeeping systems were more than just practical. They were an expression of their desire to live in harmony with the cosmos, to align their lives with the eternal cycles of the universe. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians were truly aware of the passage of time in the way we are today. Did they see time as linear, or did they view it as cyclical, a repeating cycle of life, death, and rebirth? The truth may lie somewhere in between. What we do know is that their timekeeping systems were remarkably advanced for their time, and they left a legacy that influenced not only later civilizations, but also our modern understanding of time itself. As we come to the final section of our journey through the timekeeping practices of ancient Egypt, we can reflect on how their understanding of time influenced not only their daily lives, but also their spiritual worldview. The Egyptians didn't just measure hours or minutes, they measured the rhythm of the cosmos, aligning their actions with divine cycles that transcended the material world. Time, for them, wasn't simply about counting moments. It was about understanding and living in harmony with the natural and divine order. At the heart of their timekeeping was the concept of eternity, a timeless, repeating cycle that governed all existence. For the Egyptians, the passage of time was never linear. Instead, it was seen as a cyclical process, a never-ending loop of creation, death, and rebirth. The rise and fall of the sun, the seasonal flooding of the Nile, and the movements of the stars were all reflections of this cosmic cycle. The Egyptians understood that time, like everything else in the universe, was in constant motion, an eternal flow, governed by the will of the gods. This cyclical view of time also influenced their ideas about life and death. For the Egyptians, death wasn't an end, but a transition into another phase of existence. The afterlife was a continuation of the soul's journey, not bound by earthly time, but part of the eternal cycle of the cosmos. This belief in the continuity of life beyond death shaped everything from their burial practices to their view of time itself. The pharaohs, as divine rulers, were seen as eternal beings, their reigns marking an important chapter in the ongoing cosmic cycle. Their tombs, pyramids, and mummification practices weren't just designed to preserve their bodies. They were intended to ensure their continued existence in the afterlife, where time, in a sense, had no meaning. As we step back and consider how the Egyptians viewed time, we can see how their methods of measuring it were intertwined with their religious beliefs. Time wasn't just a tool for organizing the day or the year, it was a sacred system, aligned with the gods and the natural world. The sundials, water clocks, and lunar calendars weren't just practical inventions. They were expressions of the Egyptians' belief that time was a divine force, to be respected and understood in harmony with the cosmos. Historians still debate the extent to which the Egyptians' spiritual beliefs influenced their timekeeping systems. Some argue that their primary motivation was practical. They needed ways to organize agricultural and religious activities. Others suggest that their timekeeping methods were a reflection of a deeply spiritual worldview, where every moment was an opportunity to align oneself with the divine. What is clear, however, is that the Egyptians' understanding of time went far beyond the mere ticking of a clock. They saw time as a living, breathing force, one that connected the gods, the earth, and the heavens in an eternal dance. As we close our exploration of Egyptian timekeeping, we can appreciate the complexity and beauty of their understanding of time. In a world without mechanical clocks, they managed to create a system of time that was as much about spirituality as it was about practicality. Time wasn't something they measured with precision. It was something they lived, breathed, and aligned themselves with. And in doing so, they created a timeless legacy, one that continues to influence our understanding of time today. So, as we reflect on the passage of time in our own lives, perhaps we can take a moment to appreciate how the Egyptians viewed it, not as something to be controlled or measured, but as something to be experienced in harmony with the world around us. After all, time, like the Nile, flows on, and if we align ourselves with it, we may just find a little more peace in our own journey through the cycles of life.